You are listening to the Legacy Radio Network. This is the Everything Financial Radio Show, and I'm chatting with Dr. Chris Martenson, author of The Crash Course. And, Chris, I'd like to just jump right in again. Let's talk about debt levels. Government debt as well as private sector debt. All these debt levels are, certainly in the case of government debt, at all-time highs and certainly near all-time highs as far as the private sector is concerned. What will be the consequences of all this debt?
The consequences, there's going to be an extraordinary bust at some point. And we think about debt. Debt is a claim on future money. Said another way, when we go into debt, what we're doing is we're taking future consumption today. So instead of saving up for a car for the next 10 years, I might just borrow the money, get the car today, but then I have this debt, which is a claim on my future earnings out there. And so really, debt then becomes a claim on the future economy. And when we look at the most startling statistic I've seen is that in the last 10 years, and remember, the world was in a lot of crisis over this last 10 years. Over the last 10 years, world debt has expanded by about 10.7% per year compounded. I wish I had a portfolio that would compound reliably at over 10% a year. Let's call that 11%. While the debt was compounding at 11%, GDP over that time frame of the world was growing at maybe 3.5%. Population was growing at about 1.1%. And that's the old model. The old model says that we could always just grow our debts faster, much faster than our underlying income, in this case, which would be GDP. And that really cannot go on. If it can't happen for you as a person, individually, you can't constantly grow your debt faster than your income without getting into trouble at some point. That has to be true for a collection of people. It's true for a nation. It's true for the world. So the world really, with notable exceptions, some places are doing it more than others, and that creates some local variability in this story. But the developed world, the OECD countries, oh my gosh, just piling the debts on, which is really a very inelegant way of saying, listen, we're putting all of our chips on red in this roulette wheel, and red happens to be a resumption of really rapid economic growth. And if that doesn't happen, all those debts are going to have to get wiped out one way or another. And there's only two ways debts go away. Well, three, I guess. One is you pay them off. If we can't pay them off because our future income can't service it, then we default on it. And then the third way, which is if you're a nation, you do have a third option, which is you inflate it away, which I consider a form of default, but that's called money printing. And that's exactly what the United States is doing right now with the Fed printing money out of thin air to buy somewhere between 80 and 90% of all the new debt coming out of the U.S. government. It's an extraordinary situation, Dennis.
Yeah, and Chris, that's a perfect comment to my next question for you, because as you said, the Federal Reserve, the policy I can only describe as insanity, printing $85 billion of money per month. Is this going to result in just massive inflation at some point, or are the deflationary forces of debt going to take over? How do you see this playing out?
Well, it is a balancing act right now. There's quite a bit of deflation still happening under the surface, but the Fed is creating just massive amounts of money out of thin air. And my read of history says that this has not yet ended any other way but one, and that is with a destruction of the currency involved, by which this becomes inflation at some point. It turns into hyperinflation if the monetary authorities fail to take their foot off the gas pedal. And so really the Fed is in a box at this point, because think about what they've done. They've expanded their balance sheet to about $3 trillion right now, and they've got all kinds of stuff in there, right? Mostly treasury paper, mortgage-backed securities. And so when they print $85 billion out of thin air, they do that, and then they go out and they buy these mortgage-backed securities and treasuries, and they stuff that fresh cash out into or its electronic equivalent, out into the system. In order for the Fed to take its foot off of that accelerator, it would have to then begin to reverse that process, meaning they would have to take pieces of debt instruments, treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, and push them back out into the market, take cash back. Well, who are they going to take that cash from? They would have to pull it out of banks and other large financial institutions, possibly money market funds if they got aggressive enough. It would be almost impossible to do that without utterly crashing the economy. Now, I would have trusted that Paul Volcker-led Federal Reserve might have had the temerity to do that, but I don't believe this Fed has what it takes to really crash the economy. They become heavily politicized. They make a lot of their decisions on political basis. You see Bernanke waxing eloquent on fiscal matters, which has nothing to do with his job. So it's really become, the Fed is no longer as independent as it used to be. And so I think when we look at a captive Fed that's politicized, and our politicians certainly don't want the economy ever to have to suffer, everybody just wants this to grow, grow, grow. Hey, we can read history and see that that's exactly the same confluence of events that we saw when the Romans debased their currency, what happened in Weimar Germany, what happened in dozens of times in history. So we're really, unfortunately, following a very prescribed path that's been played out dozens of times in history, always with one result, which ultimately is a destruction of the currency involved.
So, Chris, the what, I think, is a lot easier to predict than the when, as I often say, because we all know that this can't continue forever. Are you willing to go out on a limb and maybe try to predict the when?
You know, I'm not, because these things can, there's really no math formula you can plug in and say that's where it has to stop. This is a chaotic system, meaning that it's unpredictable. And this chaotic system has actual real financial things that we can get our arms around and quantify, but mostly this is going to depend on perceptions changing or altering, and it's a global set of perceptions now. And the United States is the world's reserve currency. There are very powerful sets of incentives and reverse incentives for this system not to end. For China, for Japan, for Europe, for the United States, everybody's kind of interlocked in it at this point. And yet at the same time, we can clearly look at this trend and say, this is going to end at some point. And I'll be honest with you, Dennis, I don't know if it's next Tuesday at 8:30 in the morning or if it's in 20 years from now. So my motto is, I'd rather be a year early than a day late to protecting myself from what might be coming.
You know, Chris, getting back to the whole inflation discussion, you have, I think, in your book, The Crash Course, one of the most concise explanations as to how the CPI is calculated, the government's measure of inflation. And, you know, one concludes from reading that this number is very, very much manipulated. And when you get a Social Security check and you got a raise this year of 1.7%, which corresponds to the CPI, you only need to go to the grocery store to know that that's actually not the inflation rate. Can you explain to the listeners a bit about how that number is actually manipulated?
Well, it's over time, incrementally, it's been turned from a pretty decent measure of inflation into almost a complete fiction, and it's happened across every administration. This is not even remotely a political or partisan statement I'm about to make. But what's happened is that the way we measure inflation has been massaged downwards to show a better outcome than what we're really experiencing, and by a better outcome meaning a lower amount of inflation. Because what does a high inflation reading do for you? Well, it does two things. First, it casts a bad light on your monetary policy, so the Federal Reserve hates a high inflation reading. And it casts a bad light on your fiscal policies, because if your inflation reading is high, we have all of these cost of living adjustments, the COLAs, that are tied to the inflation. So there's very powerful sets of incentives, both at the Federal Reserve and the federal government, to keep that number low. And guess what? We've come up with all sorts of really elegant, fancy-sounding statistical manipulations to help keep that number down. One example is we do something called hedonic adjustments to numbers, to the CPI numbers. And a hedonic adjustment is the government's way of trying to say, hey, listen, if you buy a phone with 30 buttons on it, that's clearly better than a phone with 20 buttons on it, because there's more features. You get more quality from that. Hedonics means for the pleasure of, right? So it's trying to capture how much we enjoy this product. So a phone with 20 buttons is not as good as one with 30 buttons. And if they cost the same amount of money, though, you need a phone. You still get one phone's worth of utility out of it. If the phone was $20 last year, $20 this year, but this one has 30 buttons on it, the government will say, well, that one actually, it's like its price went down. Even though your cash impact is exactly the same to buy it, the price went down. And so they perform hedonic adjustments on all kinds of things, cars, TVs, drugs, you name it. The result of that is you might still be spending exactly the same to have a car, a TV, or buy some drugs, but the government will be saying, but it's like it costs less. That's just one example. And there are several other statistical manipulations that are performed like that, all of which seek to really just drive down what the real rate of inflation is. So if you are somebody on a Social Security check and you got your 1.7% COLA bump, most of those people happen to be retirees, and they're heavily exposed to things like heating costs, property taxes, which aren't even included in any inflation statistics whatsoever, and medical devices and care and drugs. All of those things are obviously increasing at a rate much faster than 1.7%, so you're just getting squeezed slowly if you're tied to that system.
Chris, we've got about 2.5 minutes left. Given that your outlook is that if they keep printing money, we're going to have inflation. If they stop, we're going to have probably a crash in the system, which would typically be deflation. You can correct me if you have a different opinion. Are you personally, and are you suggesting to people then that certainly tangible assets in one's portfolio make sense?
Not just tangible assets, but ones that are actually outside of other people's or other institutions' responsibility or care. Because here's one of the things I don't know, Dennis, is I don't know where the risks are in the system anymore. So if I have a portfolio and it consists of maybe I've got some GLD, which is the gold tracking trust, so I think I've got some exposure to gold, but that's been issued to me through a trust, which then has been being carried by another institution. I don't know where the risks are anymore. We have over $700 trillion in derivatives outstanding. The banks have been allowed to obscure the true nature of their balance sheets through what's called mark-to-fantasy accounting. We no longer really have a good sense of where those things are. So I truly believe that in times when your money systems are at risk of either going through a deflationary collapse or an inflationary explosion, in either of those cases, history suggests you want real, tangible assets. So you want to actually be holding something like physical gold, physical silver, farmland, really good commercial real estate that has, obviously very, very solid, rentals and tenancy. Things like that tend to perform really well in either of those two environments. And so yes, it's time to stop thinking of investments as just a statement I get, it's on paper, maybe I see it online, but ultimately it's stuff that I'm not really totally connected to. It's out there in the system somewhere, and start reeling that back in and having really tangible assets. And I'll admit it, I'm still a large fan of gold at this point because it's the only monetary asset I'm aware of that is not simultaneously somebody else's liability. That just removes all sorts of risks for me in an age when I'm not clear where the risks actually lie.
Well, Dr. Chris Martenson, thank you for joining us today. The book is The Crash Course. The website is peakprosperity.com. So certainly hope you'll come back, Chris.
Thank you, Dennis. It's been a pleasure.
Everything Financial Radio will return after these words. Stay with us.